Welcome, everybody. We are here at the webinar on the update of the shared socioeconomic pathways. They were, I think, expected to happen for quite a while. Many of us are using the SSPs in a lot of our research, and we started to realize that over time they were getting somewhat outdated. And so we've already for a while thought it was really important to make sure that the scenarios got updated. It was quite a work to get that done. Hence, also over time, we were a little bit slower than expected, but here they are finally. And we would like to present them at this webinar, the work that has been done. And it has been done by a lot of people in the community, especially at OECD, at the IIASA. The results will be presented at the webinar. And the webinar will be moderated by Keywan, Riahi from IASA, and myself. And it's organized by ICONICS and the IMC. Can you move to the next slide, Keywan? Yeah, so in updating, obviously we can have many different ambitions in terms of updates. So first of all, the most minimum is that we ensure that the historical situation is consistent with what we have seen in the past. And because the previous set of SSPs mostly had data up to about 2010, maybe 2012. Since then, we know that a lot of unexpected things happened, including COVID. And as a result, at least bringing the base year up to date is the minimum level of ambition. But as a result of changes in the past, maybe also our expectations of the future have changed. And as a result, also the dynamics will change. So the next level of ambition is to use the existing scenarios, but also update the numbers in the future and including new dynamics. But we can even be more ambitious in updating. And for instance, for the SSPs, some of the narratives that were in there might not be as likely anymore. And maybe other narratives have become more important. And so a third level of ambition might be that we even start to rethink the existing narratives and adjust them on the basis of what we have seen. And the most important level, the most ambitious level is to replace the total framework. The SSPs were developed around 2012 to 2016 and were formulated against questions that were really relevant at the time with respect to challenges to climate policy and the formulation of mitigation and adaptation policies. Maybe it's still relevant, but at some point, obviously, we have to start thinking whether the axes that we used at the time and the scenarios that were developed at the time are still useful. At some point, we have to replace that as well. But we thought that at this point of time, given the fact that the SSPs are widely used, the very first and very most important thing that we should do is to do an update at this level too, and make sure that we have new projections that are consistent with historical pathways, but also are consistent with our current expectations of the future. And so that's what we have done in the last 2 years, and that's what we're going to present. And for the agenda, I will now give the word further to Keywan and also to describe a little bit the process that we have done. Back to you, Keywan.
Yeah, thank you, Detlef. So in today's meeting and webinar, we want particularly to present to you the updates of the population and economic developments of the SSPs, which have been completed so far and which went also to quite some extensive external and internal review and vetting by the community in the year 2023. This is part of a bigger update. Next, we will also launch the updated projections for urbanizations. There is also discussions about downscaling the socioeconomic projections to spatial scales, which is particularly relevant for impacts, which is forthcoming. We don't have a timeline for this yet, but as soon as we have the commitments from the colleagues and know their availability, we will also inform you about the timeline of the downscaling. And finally, in this round of the updates, we want also to add new elements, particularly elements that allow us better to characterize poverty and equity particularly within country distributions, for example, for income. And this is also something that is forthcoming and under preparation. In addition to the standard SSP outputs, there is also an activity at the moment to gather as much other so-called extensions of the SSPs, which can be used for research. And that's something that you will see in a webinar on the 29th. And let me pass on very quickly to Marina Andrejevic, which is leading the Extension Explorer.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Keywan, and thanks everyone for the opportunity to also announce the official launch of this new tool, the SSP Extensions Explorer. So this is really a parallel effort that a team of us at IIASA have been working on together with the authors of the respective extensions. So extensions meaning quantifications of the SSP framework that have emerged in the literature since the publication of the original drivers. So since population, economic growth, and urbanization. And now we have a very nice tool where we visualize more than 15 indicators and collect them in one place. So also make them available, of course, for download. In addition to that, we also provide learning resources, including rationales of the various authors for developing these extensions to the SSP framework. So I'll keep it short and just invite you to register for the official launch on February 29th at the same. So this is exactly 3 weeks from now at the same time, different link, same time. Here's the QR code, but I'll be posting the link also in the chat. So yeah, thanks again. And I'm looking forward to seeing many of you there.
Great, thank you, Marina. And before perhaps passing on to the presentations of the socioeconomic projections, let me highlight to you also the SSP Explorer, where you can find all the data that is going to be presented today. Basically, we'll find the updated national projections for population as well as for GDP, but also the urbanization data, which is under fast track review. And the web page you can see on top here, and the SSP Explorer is quite a nice tool where you can also create different figures, and you can also bulk download all the data if you are mainly interested in the data in Excel format. Yeah, with this, let me perhaps introduce our three speakers. First, we will hear from Samir Casey at IIASA about the population projections. And then his talk will be followed by two presentations by Rob Dellink and Jesus Crespo Cuaresma, who will present two alternative GDP projections, the marker projections from the OECD group by Rob, and then Jesus will also introduce IIASA projections and differences across the two GDP projections. So with this, I will stop sharing my screen and pass on to you, Samir.
Thank you, Kevin, and also Marina and everyone who I almost couldn't find the link somehow earlier. I am going to share my screen, the second screen, and then I hope you see okay. You don't see my screen, right?
We do see your screen, but it's in the wrong mode. It says present. We can see also the presentation on the. Yeah, exactly. If you now put it in presentation mode, it will work.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Okay, great. Yeah, this actually is actually more than 2 years. I think we started in September of one of the year, and now it's almost 2.5 years that we came to this stage. At the beginning, we thought this would be done in 6 months, but we realized that when we came here to update after 10 years, we found that a lot of things had to be, worked on, and the scenarios also, especially the SSP2 scenario, which is our medium scenario, we have to really work a lot. And so you will see that by the end, we will also list down the results as well as the papers coming out of this exercise. So first of all, I would like to acknowledge all of our colleagues that have contributed to this update. Yes, most of us are affiliated with Wittgenstein Center, but IIASA, at IIASA we are, the main projections are done at IIASA, but we have a contribution also from Shanghai University. So basically, a lot of these pictures, maybe you have already seen it earlier in earlier presentations that we were making when we were showing some results for review and getting comments from many of you. So basically, this is the world population in 2020. That about more than 7.8 billion people were projected into the future by age, sex, and level of education in a 5-year list step. So this is just a running animation of the population projections that is coming out of this exercise, this update. Earlier we have started this process, so our main feature that at IIASA and at Wittgenstein Center we are doing or contributing to the this population projection exercise is bringing education or the representing human capital into our, when we're thinking about the future of the world population, bringing education in and then thinking about it again. So this is what we did, and we have been doing this, trying to convince ourselves and others that this is an important dimensions to include, in addition to age and sex, which is like a fundamental to demographic, let's say, components of dimensions of change, right? Dimension that you need to consider. So from 2007, we started with the reconstruction of the population by adding education to it. In 2010, we did our first global projection. We basically took what the UN assumed there about the future and brought education in. But we had a big exercise that we did in 2013, and that was our first SSPs. So while we were doing our global projections, thinking about the future of the world's population and human capital, so the SSP community asked us to, also help in defining the SSPs, and that's where our first SSPs came in. But we were continuously working on, new data updates, and in 2018, let's say we can call it, for us at the SSP community, we can call it like the intermediary update. So we have been updating our projections, but it was not included in to the SSP database. So finally, after 10 years, we call it Wittgenstein Center 2030 projections, which would be out here. It would be SSP 3.0 data there. So this is just a short history of how we came to the current status of our projections. And so we have about 200 countries in our projection model, and these 200 countries, some countries are missing, like I think Kosovo and few other smaller countries are missing, or regions are missing. But since we had to rely on what the UN estimates are available, we were only doing it for 220 countries. 200 countries, and then basically, going to 2100. Yeah. So when you see lots of blue color that represent the upper secondary and post-secondary, and the very red represent no education. So in 2020, we still see a lot of countries having lots of rates, and in some cases, it's more females having no education than males. So we did projection until 2100. And based on our scenarios that we have defined, some countries still have some rates. And of course, we need to think and look at, we did look at it and Yeah, so there are some such expectation in some countries. Now, why did we need the update? And I don't think we need to go into details about it, because things are changing, and what we were thinking when we were projecting last time in 2010, 11, 12, around that time, a lot had changed. And for us, it is the initial population structure, fertility, mortality, migration. These are the three main components of demographic change. But at the same time, we have this education attainment transitions, which are also very important, because there is lots of we have a clear association between education attainment with fertility, mortality, as well migration. So this is these are few graphs that we have put together, where like for 2020 we were looking at the population, that population totals. So we took the ratio of population in 2020 that we predicted, or that we projected in 2013, right? So and then what was reported by the UN in 2022. So if they would fall in this line, so it is basically a ratio. So if they fall in this line, that means that the population size is the same that we were projecting in 2010 in this first SSPs. But you see that lots of countries have numbers, these dots scattered all around. And say in Africa, we were, in many countries, we were actually estimating, or our projection was lower than what actually was counted or reported by the UN. But in some North America, it seems to be two countries there with Canada and US. They seem to be quite close to what we were projecting. So there all this scatteredness shows that we have to start with the new 2020 population structure and size. Then we also looked into the components of demographic changes, like in terms of mortality. We looked at life expectancy, and we found, again, this is the same story for 2015-20, because this is a 5-year. These are the period rates, right? So these are the period rates that changes the population structure. So on the x-axis we have the life expectancy at birth that we were projecting 10 years ago, and then on the y-axis we have one that is reported by the UN. And again, here this line, this diagonal line, so if the points are closer to the diagonal line, then then it means that we were quite on target or on the spot. But you see that lots of African countries, the life expectancy at birth actually is much higher than what we were projecting then, and it's a good good news that because of the improvement in the under 5 the child mortality, infant mortality rates, as well as other AIDS and all related. Yeah, I'm just watching my time. So further, we also looked at the TFR, the fertility rates, and there also, interestingly, the similar picture. Lots of African countries, the fertility rate didn't decline as much as we were expecting, but at the same time, so these are the total fertility rates, births per women. So it's like 6. In the US, it's like between 4 to 6. So there's very high fertility rates here. And we were expecting it to come to this line, but somehow, the expectation was not kind of made. But on the other hand, we can also see that for countries where the fertility is quite low, the decline was much faster in many countries than what we were expecting. So this fertility was also lying all over the places. And then there is migration. So migration is the most difficult for us to handle, but whatever data we could manage to get, it's just showing, just some points that's lying above or below the line, shows that they are not aligning to what we were expecting. And this Pakistan comes to be a very special case here, and it's mostly due to the refugee movement and all those things. So So what we did this time, not to go into too much details of demography, which now we have a working paper released actually today, that we have updated the population, fertility, and mortality. We also updated with the new migration data. Guy Abel's work has been very contributing to these changes. What we didn't do is that we kept the long-term assumptions mostly intact, so we didn't change it much, as Detlef was saying earlier. But we had to bring in the COVID-19 effect. We had to bring in the effect of Ukraine, even some extent the Syria's impact on the what happened in Syria, the impact related Syrian refugee crisis that was also brought in. We updated the mortality differentials by education. This was one paper, working paper is kind of dedicated to this. This is new. I mean, we have expanded to using a lot of country-specific information. Fertility differentials by educations were also updated. And then a new thing that we did here is like the education-specific bilateral migration flows, meaning education-specific migration rates and all, the flows were not there at the beginning because we didn't have enough evidence to bring in it, but now it is there, and some remodeling has been done. So this is the old SSPs. The one difference that I wanted to point out is that, so there are different 5 SSPs that we have, and then there are like, different components of change. Initially, we had these 3 groups, this high fertility, low fertility, and rich OECD countries. Actually, I marked it in the wrong place. This would be low fertility and rich OECD countries. These 2 sets of countries, we had sometimes different scenarios, but we got lots of comments after first SSPs that it sometimes sounds very artificial when we are just, we have 2 countries that are neighbors having low fertility in both countries, but because it's a rich OECD country, we had a difference in that. So what we did this time, or since 2018, we are already doing, was that we just had for the demographic exercises projection, we just have the high fertility and low fertility countries, and mostly we kept the same narratives for these SSPs, demographic narratives, but some little changes has happened. Yeah? And finally, the result part. Of course, you will find so many, like these these options to check the real the data results. But here I just show that I have this like solid lines showing the past SSPs from 2013, and then the new ones are with dashed. Sorry, this is the opposite. Yeah, I'm a little colorblind, but yeah, the dashed lines are you cannot see it here. The dashed lines are the new ones. And then some differences we see here. One of the main difference is, like just focus on the SSP2. We find that what we were thinking 10 years ago, we started, first of all, we were starting from a little lower value then. And then our assumptions, all this fertility kind of expectations that was not made, and also the improvement in mortality. These are two of the main reasons that currently we have the higher expectation of the peak world population passing 10 billion. So I think around 10.12 billion is our SSP2 expectation, which is much higher than 9.4 billion that we were expecting in the earlier SSP. So this was the big change that we want to report, and we have the explanation as well. So all the others kind of follow that, yeah. And then and as I said, there was this reason when we are grouping this low fertility and the rich OECD country into one, that also resulted some big difference for the SSP4 especially. So I was just going through that. Yeah, I can answer more questions later. And this is just a comparison between the UN and our projection. Whereas, both UN's expectation in their kind of a medium scenario, or their way of expressing the medium scenario, is much higher than ours. Well, not much higher, but about 400 million higher than ours. But the age structure is quite different. So our age structure is much older, meaning that we have younger population in the future, whereas the UN has still have some, the younger population is a bit larger. So this shows that UN and ours, we have some fertility differences, but at the same time, there is also the mortality differences. So we are kind of more optimistic in terms of future expectation of life, whereas UN is a bit less. But all of these, many of these are discussed in the working paper. And this is the result by level of education, population total of the world, under 15 years. So we see that the number of children will somehow decline, start declining, and most of our population will be the elderly or the adult population, but a lot of people will be a lot more educated than what we have now. And there are some examples, the world population showing like, for different time, 2020, 2050, and 2100, just to compare between different SSPs. And I will go into the releases, that just because this seems to be like, we are at the end of this exercise. And while SSP, we have the SSP database to share with you all, we also have our own Wittgenstein Center database, where we put more details, demographic and human capital related indicators and all that might not be needed to put in the SSPs. But if you want to go into the details of all the processes that went through here and the results, you could go into this, our data explorer. We have 4 technical IIASA working papers. 2 have been already published and 2 are in the pipeline. Genedo the data has been released into the Genedo. So basically we have lots of indicators in the data explorer. And there is also a way to download those input data, those of indicators in the R package. You can see it in the space. But in Zenedo, we have put the raw calculation, all the files that were input and output files are put here. So if somebody wants to replicate what we have done, this will be a useful place. So next, we are also, because we are not just projecting, we are also doing this back projections until 1950. So the current back projection that is available, somehow for some countries, they do not match because there were some updates on the initial data. And we are working on it. There are basically 2 phases. One phase is complete, and the next one we are working on it. It might take 2-3 months to complete it. And what I really want to put here is like, we are done with this process. And of course, there might be some issues we might find, and we will continue to watch out for that. And we welcome anything that you would report to us. But we are open for collaboration, at IIASA Wittgenstein Center. For example, running alternative scenarios. I already get lots of few requests of doing alternative scenarios. So what happens if we switch off the migration, or we change the education scenarios, or there could be so many other things. So and then one really important thing that we should all think about is, at the moment we don't have in the projection model, we don't have any feedback from anywhere. So this is what we are really interested to work with people on. If you have some story or narratives to check with the climate change impact on demography and all at this, and then also the subnational SSPs, what we are also working on. So in conclusion, we have updated the.
Samir, you would need to accelerate the conclusion slide, please.
Yeah. Okay. So this basically, I think we have done our work, and there are lots of things still to be done. Like in this exercise, we got lots of like a list of things that we want to do in the future, right? And finally, just a list of references I would just put out here to say that these are the ones that the 2 of them are already out, and the 2 are in the pipeline. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Samir. let me emphasize that we have the Q&A boxes for questions. We will have some time at the end, hopefully, to also to raise questions. But if you have questions to any of the speakers, please use the QA boxes. We will try to answer all of them and also make them available after the session. So next we move now to Rob Dellink and hear about the GDP projections. Rob, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Keywan. Let me share my screen. There we go. All right, so after Samir has done his population and demographics projections, we use those to create calculations, to make projections of GDP and therefore also what we call income, which is GDP per capita. This is joint work with OECD Environment Directorate and OECD Economics Department, or with colleagues from there. These are not official OECD projections. They are not vetted by our governments. The OECD normally, when they produce statistics, etc., these have been reviewed by governments and vetted by governments. But because this is a community exercise, we have not gone that route. So this is purely on the authority of the authors and not on the authority of the OECD as an organization. So the objectives are that the world has changed between 2013 or so when we did this the first analysis and now. And we have a number of developments, the demographics, of course, the volatility of resource prices, especially in Africa. Natural resource prices were already by 2015 quite different and led to GDP changes. There's been the COVID pandemic and the Ukraine war as major shocks. So we felt it was necessary to do an update of these scenario projections for GDP with the same storylines as Detlef introduced in the beginning. So no major revisions of the methodology, but updating all the drivers and updating also all the databases and using the latest data where available. So the ENV growth model, very briefly, it's a model that basically describes GDP from three different sources. It's labor inputs, its capital inputs, and its productivity, what we call total factor productivity. And the idea is that countries, as they are further from their frontier, they're growing faster. And also the frontier itself, the technology frontier, is also moving over time. So that then drives technological progress, and that's driven by a number of underlying factors. For example, trade openness. If you have more trade, you will more quickly have access to new technology, etc. The second bundle is then physical capital, where we have investment driving physical capital, and that is over time basically adapting to what the new GDP per capita levels are. And finally, labor, which is where they have the direct links with the projections that Samir has done, where we have education, age structure, population, participation rates, and unemployment rates all finding together into human capital and employment, and those together give us GDP. Now, for a number of countries, say Saudi Arabia, Qatar, etc., it doesn't make sense to you to look at labor and capital and technology to project their GDP levels, because those are predominantly coming from the rents from the sale of oil and gas. So we have for those countries which have a significant oil and gas resource, we have a natural resource value added that we add to the part that is coming from labor and physical capital and productivity. So this accounts for oil and gas revenues, basically. So in the old SSPs, what we did is we looked at, we had differences, of course, in income. With this is blue line at the top is high income countries. The lowest one, yellow, is the low income countries, and in black is the world. And then in between, we have upper middle and lower middle countries. And if you then compare that to what actually happened, there's three things that are visible. One is actually in 2015, GDP levels were already higher than they were when we did the original estimate. And part of this is just a reassessment of GDP through the national accounts. And part of this is also the update of the PPP, the purchasing power parity exchange rates from the 2005 numbers that we had originally to the latest 2017. You also see the big dip, especially for high-income countries from the COVID crisis, and slightly less visible, but you also see the yellow line, the line of the low-income countries, is actually flatter than what we had predicted. And I think we can show it more easily if you look at growth rates. If you look at the G7 group of countries, the blue line is the original projection, and we were doing a fairly decent job, except that COVID crisis had led to this big downfall in 2020 and some recovery in 2021. And but on average, this was not a bad projection that we had. But if you look at sub-Saharan Africa, we had projected growth rates in the order of magnitude of 4%. And actually, it has been in several years been below 0%. And it's consistently been lower than what we had originally projected. So we now have 192 countries in the new projections. We're missing Afghanistan, Curacao, Syria, Venezuela, and the French overseas territories. I won't go into all the details, but for example, Venezuela, we just miss any economic data. This is not, there's no projections from IMF or OECD or World Bank available. So that's one that we cannot handle currently in the model. And for the French overseas territories, it's a bit of a peculiar case. This is actually in the administration. These are actually French territories. So in the French national accounts, this is included in GDP, even though for demographic projections, they normally separate it out. We could, in principle, separate those out, but that wouldn't make it less consistent with normal national accounts GDP projections. Population and education, I already said, that's Samir. The purchasing power parities have been updated. And now we have also included the latest short-term GDP forecast to 2028. So basically what the model does is it takes until 2028, it uses the short-term forecasts across all the 5 SSPs, and then it assumes that the deviations between the SSPs starts in 2029. So for the very short run, we see no significant difference between the different SSPs, but only after the forecast. That also means that because we use the latest forecast from November, December 2023, we have effects of the Ukraine war, etc., in these projections. But this is, of course, a point projection of how, by the end of 2023, the IMF and the OECD and the World Bank, how they see the evolution of these events. And of course, we cannot predict what would really happen in these geopolitical events. So there is, of course, always an uncertainty associated with that. The methodology is largely consistent with the original SSP calculations, but we did make a change in the investment convergence rule, and I'm happy to explain that to whoever is interested in that, but I'll skip it for now. So then looking at the growth rates across SSPs, this is SSP2. So basically, we have still the highest projections for low-income countries, is the yellow line, and they have a prolonged period of almost 4% growth in our projections, driven by the idea that they have a lot of potential for GDP growth and for technology catch-up to more advanced countries. Whereas in high-income countries, growth is significantly below the global average because these countries are already quite developed, and therefore it's mostly driven by the progress of the frontier itself, so real technological progress that drives economic growth there. In the SSP1 and SSP5 scenarios, the high ones, we see a bigger boom in short-term growth as we assume that countries are converging more rapidly to their frontier, and they also have higher long-term growth effects, and therefore the projections are basically higher, but this effect is most dominant in the coming decades. Whereas in SSP3 and 4, we see lower economic income growth projections, and especially SSP3 is the one where we have very low growth. And in SSP4 is a bit of a mixed case where we have for low-income countries, it's more like an SSP3 type scenario, while for high-income countries, it's more of an SSP2 or an SSP1 type of world. It's not exactly the same. So you see actually that the difference in growth rates in SSP4 is much smaller between the income groups. So if we then compare what we did originally for SSP2 with what we do now, you see that in a very short run, we have this COVID thing and much more fluctuation. You also see that the lines are now smoother because we actually have a better way of handling the interpolation of the 5-year population projections to annual projections. So we have more smooth lines, annual lines for the GDP projections, but you also see that we have lower growth in low-income countries than we had originally foreseen. So the new projections are a little bit more pessimistic, basically, than what we had before. So here, very quickly, is then what you get in terms of the comparison between the old and the new ones for the global GDP growth rate, the GDP per capita growth rate. And that is SSP2 is basically the same. In the SSP1 and SSP5, we clearly see that we had overestimated growth until 2025. So therefore, it now starts from a lower level. But in the very long run, actually, in all 4 or 5 scenarios, we have annual growth rates that are fairly similar to what we had before. Only in SSP3, we have a more more of an ease of the growth rate downwards over time, and that means lower growth rates by the end of the century. So where does this difference in the levels then come from? And that is basically if you go from the original SSPs on the left-hand side, and then there's the new scale, the updated 2010 values from the reassessment of historical GDP levels and the update of the purchasing power parity exchange rate. That gives us an increase in the level of GDP. But then we have new data for the historical years, and that actually leads to a lower. So we were over optimistic on economic growth until 2021 originally. And then there's a very small effect from Samir's data, the updated demographics, and then you get a new SSP level that is actually higher in numbers than what we had 10 years before. And if you look at it by the end of the century, we still have the scale effects, of course. We still have the data effects, but now we have a new effect, and that is we are a bit less optimistic on economic growth in the long run. And that also drives the long run GDP level a bit down. The demographic projections, even though projections are different, there's a very small effect on global GDP. And that is mostly because population plays a dual role in the economic model. If you look at GDP per capita, so basically a higher population, a higher working age population means higher labor supply and therefore a higher GDP. But GDP per capita, of course, is divided by total population. So the effect of the new projections depends on the ratio between the working age population and the total population in the sense of deriving what is that a driver of more economic growth or a driver of less economic. But in the end, we have a bit different SSP levels, but actually the differences are not as large as one might expect a priori. So we have an OECD working paper coming up to describe all this, and we have a focus on the new projections. We hope to also publish the annual data on the OECD website called OECD.stat, but we have not done that yet. That would be forthcoming in probably 1 or 2 months. And there will be annual numbers. And also we are planning to present everything and comparing also with the original and the new ones in a journal article. So with that, I thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Rob. Let's move directly to the last presentation for today.
Keywan, you muted yourself accidentally.
Sorry. I just wanted to say that we moved to the last presentation by Jesus, Crespo, Cuaresma. Jesus, the floor is yours. We might run, we want to have some time at the end for Q&A, for questions.
I'll just need 3 minutes.
No. Take your time. We will run probably a little bit over. I hope for your indulgence. Thank you.
That's fine. Thank you very much. So actually, I'm so happy to present right after Rob, since some of the mechanisms behind the GDP projections that he presented are also present in the IIASA model. and that makes my job much easier. So let me very briefly tell you about the update of the GDP projections from the IASA front. This is joint work with Jakob Zellman, who's a young research assistant that has been helping quite a lot in creating these GDP projections. So, as in the case of Rob, we have not changed the methodological framework in which those GDP projections are being created. So the same way as we put the microscope on the dynamics of human capital as a driver of economic growth in our projections 10 years ago, we are doing the same in these ones, and we're just updating the data. We're updating the estimates that we can now get with longer historical series, and we are updating also the purchasing power parity adjustment. So the methodological framework is identical to the one that we used in the first round of SSP projections. It's basically an aggregate production function where total GDP of an economy depends on total factor productivity, as in the case of the OECD model, capital accumulation, and their education and age-specific labor input. So we are, as I said, putting the emphasis on trying to understand how changes in age and education structure help explain economic growth trends. We have divided our labor input into 2 age groups and 4 education groups, just in the same way as we did in the first round of projections. And we assume that total factor productivity, basically technological improvements, on the one hand, can be explained through innovation, which also is directly related to human capital dynamics, and to technology adoption, which is related to the interaction between human capital and the level of development you have, meaning the distance to the technological frontier that also Rob was talking about. We took the model just as the one that we had, and we re-estimated it using the most recent data. Basically, we used a panel data set of 171 countries covering the period 1970 to 2019 in 5-year intervals with the same type of sources as Rob was talking about. The scenario assumptions are identical to those in the 2013 round, with the exception, of course, that we are using the new generation of population projections by age and education, the ones that Samir just presented. We are using the same conceptual setting for the dynamics of capital accumulation, with the only difference that we are now estimating those dynamics based on data up to 2019 instead of up to data with data up to 2010. And we are keeping the same assumptions in terms of institutional convergence across countries in the world, which is quantified by the so-called fixed effect of our model. So the only difference is that we have estimated it in a larger sample. We have updated our population projections. And as Rob also commented, instead of linking the projections that we get directly to the end of the data that we have created a smooth transition to the SSP projections, making use of IMF forecasts, in our case, with IMF forecast data from 2020 to 2025, and then linking our projections directly to the 2025-2030 period. Otherwise, the projection exercise is methodologically consistent with what we did in our last round. And this is basically the difference between the results we got back in 2013 and the results we get now in 2024, even when the results are of 2023. What you see in the y-axis is the income growth of all countries of the world over the period 2025 to 2100, which is projected under the SSP2 scenario. In the case of the y-axis, they are the old projections, and in the x-axis, you have the new projections. And as you can see, you have this positive correlation, which basically implies that the story has not changed, the narrative has not changed significantly. However, if you have a look at the 45-degree line, which is that blue line in there, you can see that on average, we tend to be more pessimistic in the 2023 projections as compared to the 2013 projections, which also goes in line with the results that the OECD has gotten. There are exceptions for certain countries, but on average, we have more pessimistic economic growth projections in this round. We are also slightly more pessimistic than the OECD is using the model that Rob just presented. So this is the same graph, only that on the y-axis you have the projected income growth for the OECD. As you can see, both of the projected economic growth rates strongly correlate positively, meaning that we are telling also very similar stories, but in terms of level, the IASA projections are slightly more pessimistic. The same thing goes through when you have a look at all the SSP scenarios. So here you have SSP 1, 3, 4, and 5. For the cases of the most optimistic scenarios 1 and 5, the underestimation or the more pessimistic view of the new projections is relatively smaller. The picture is a little bit more heterogeneous if you have a look at SSP3, which being a scenario which basically implies stagnation, depends very much on the initial conditions of the countries, which have, of course, significantly changed from 2013 to 2023. So just to sum up, what is new in the 2023 update of the IASA projections, and what are the main features? First of all, on average, for all scenarios, the GDP per capita projections are slightly less optimistic than those that we had 10 years ago, and also less optimistic than those of the OECD. We can therefore ask ourselves what is driving those differences? Why are we more pessimistic now? When you have a look at the determinants of economic growth that basically are implied by our model, as you may imagine, it's human capital accumulation scenarios that have changed significantly and that have also led to different dynamics in terms of GDP and GDP per capita growth. So the more pessimistic human capital accumulation scenarios lead to slower and smaller productivity gains over the projection period, which mixed with the fact that lower levels of human capital also imply a lower convergence rate of income per capita across countries, as implied by the model that we estimated on historical data. That implies also that developing economies in all of our scenarios take longer to converge to developed economies than they did with the 2013 settings. And that's it from my side. Happy to answer any type of questions that may come.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks to all the speakers. This was really informative. Yeah, so we still have a little bit of time to answer a couple of questions directly. We, as announced by Keywan, that's also maybe for those that can run a little bit over. I myself would like to directly respond to two questions that are at the end by Claude and by Ricardo. So this exercise is part of a somewhat larger process. Keywan already indicated a bit of that in the beginning when he presented the process. So we are planning to soon also give information on urbanization, which will be quickly reviewed in the coming months. We also are already working on income distribution, which we plan to make available, and also population densities, so the population maps information will be shared soon. So what we also plan to do is to have this new information being run by the integrated assessment models. And we haven't made a timeline there yet, but that means that those will be looking into things like per capita food production or energy mixes and emissions. And yes, that information will become available, but we still have to think on what timescale, and that process will start now. And that information will be used as well in the new CMAP runs. We didn't change the narratives, and so it means that some of the runs that go into CMAP will still be looking into similar mitigation strategies. At the same time, there are individual model studies that look into different mitigation strategies, including degrowth. I would like to move a bit to some of the other questions and especially take on some questions that are slightly broader. And so I saw that you already gave an answer to Yvonne, Rob, but that question, when we were doing the calibration of the models, we found out that to some degree that there was a difference between what we projected and what actually happened in the past. And so the fact that, for instance, economic growth in African countries was lower, would it mean also that we have to change possibly the projections in terms of the outlook into the future? Can you say something about that, Rob?
I certainly can. Yeah, so, well, to some extent, the low growth rates for Sub-Saharan Africa were connected to resource crash of resource prices in 2015, which led to significantly lower revenues for lots of countries that are exporting these resources. This is definitely a weak point in our model, that we don't have these resources projected. It's also very hard because there is no single global price. We know that these commodity prices are linked to each other, but you would need a very detailed model to come up with good projections on these commodity prices over time, and therefore the export revenues that these countries would get. So it's hard to add this into the model, and we have not been able to do that yet. But what we do now is basically we have these observed values. Then what we use for the period 2022 to 2028 is we look at what the World Bank and the IMF are forecasting, and especially the IMF has an annual forecast rate for all these countries that we then apply and take up in our model. So at least until 2028, the model has growth rates that are coming from the IMF, and we think that that's the most authoritative source out there. And then what we do from 2029 is actually start from that level of growth to then see whether some countries then catch up further in growth and start increasing their growth rate. Some countries don't. It depends really on the country. But of course, what these GDP projections mean is that there is no further unforeseen geopolitical events. There's no natural disasters. There's no turmoil, war. All these things are abstracted from in these projections. So this is what we call potential GDP. It's not actual GDP. And actual GDP will almost always be lower because natural disasters, wars, and all these other things that we do not want to project into the future, those tend to have a negative effect on GDP. So real GDP is often historically a bit lower than what we project out there.
Yes, thanks, Rob. And maybe this is one other important point to clarify. And in the methods in developing the SSPs, we decided to not include feedbacks of climate change, for instance, on GDP and population. Which is a bit odd because we feel that obviously climate change or air pollution are important features. The only reason to not do it is that we would like to provide these projections also to teams that are researching impacts. And when we originally developed these scenarios, we thought it would be most helpful if we did not include them so that you would not be confused if you do impact studies. At some point of time, as indicated also for instance, in a publication led by Brian O'Neill, we have to revise that assumption, and we obviously could at some point of time provide projections with and without impacts, for instance. But this needs to be in a next round. And so we all agree that these feedbacks will be important, and so we have to find a way to include them in the community projections. Maybe Samir, was an important question as well from Vanessa on population projections, and you gave already an answer, but maybe it's also an interesting one to share with the community, which was about also the mismatch and the extended lifespan as a contribution for the shifts in global population by 2100. Can you say something about that? Samir?
Yes. So So I think the question is about that I said something about like how the extended lifespan that we are assuming has an impact on the population. But Vanisha also asked about the improvement in whether the improvement there was slower improvement in the educational attainment than expected, and I answered that I should have put one slide on that as well. I think what I remember is that the education expectation was okay. I think it was fine. So it was not so, especially because there are 5 levels of education transition, like primary, secondary, and post-secondary, upper secondary. So especially for the primary and others, I think they were quite fine. But for the higher education, I don't remember now how it was, and I also mentioned that while this fertility, mortality, and migration informations were readily available through UN estimates, there is no education. This education informations are not. We actually collected. So we collected by asking the National Statistical Office and all. So I think whatever we have collected on we might not be as comprehensive as the UN, but whatever we have is definitely the latest one. And this particular question about whether how the education has changed, I think I can't exactly say it now, but definitely there was not a big surprise there. Yeah.
Thanks. Rob, the question of Ben, you were typing an answer, but maybe you can directly go into public. The question is, for the countries that have a significant fraction of the GDP for fossil fuel extraction, is this taking account into the projections also in relation to climate policy? Oh, you're muted, Rob. You have to unmute.
Sorry. Excellent question, which is why I was already typing an answer. So what we assume is that there is a current policy scenario where governments are doing something to phase out fossil fuels, but it's definitely not a low carbon scenario, because we want to make a scenario aligned with the policy storylines that is basically a reference point for analyzing climate policy. So we do not want to already preempt that by adding a low carbon transition, for example, in fossil fuel use. That's for the integrated assessment models that use the GDP projections to then make scenarios on. So what we do is the effect of a current policies scenario in which you have some substitution away from fossil fuels, but not too much. This is the one point where potentially there could be a revision of the GDP scenarios next year if all the integrated assessment scenarios find that we are completely off in one way or the other on the fossil fuel revenues. We did the same thing 10 years ago when we made the original SSP scenarios, and we found that it actually worked pretty well, and we were well aligned with the integrated assessment models. So I'm hoping that the same holds now.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Yeah, so I think the speakers have been really productive as well in answering many of the questions in the Q&A box, and we're already 5 minutes over time. So it might be a good moment to round up. Yeah, one of the questions was also, should we be starting using these scenarios now or wait for any revisions? No, I think at this point of time, these scenarios are for the SSPs simply the best we have in town. And there are many improvements that we can still make in the future. But I think we would recommend using these updates now, which are absolutely better than the original scenarios if you start using them right now. So we are very happy that we have made this progress. We would also very much thank the IIASA and OECD teams for making these steps and making the data available. And also I would like to thank the speakers for sharing and their work and the presentations. Keywan, any last words from you? Okay, thanks. So in that case, we will round up the webinar. As indicated, both the webinar itself and the presentations will be shared on the IMC website. The data itself will be available at the Explorer at the IASA, and there will be a next webinar very soon on the extensions, as announced as well by Marina. So thank you all.